It was supposed to be routine, a quiet order placed under strict confidentiality. But within minutes, a florist who had served the palace for years froze mid-action, hands shaking, breath caught after seeing a single name attached to the delivery card. What followed wasn't delay or confusion. It was refusal. A refusal so sharp, so absolute, that it sent shockwaves through royal backchannels before the flowers even left the shop. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, this florist had operated in silence, trusted not just with arrangements but with secrets, anniversaries never announced, apologies never acknowledged, gestures meant to heal wounds without headlines. Royal orders arrived frequently, always handled with discretion, always fulfilled without question. That was the unspoken rule. You did not pause. You did not judge. You certainly did not refuse. Yet this time, something snapped the rhythm that had governed the shop for decades. The moment the card was read, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Scissors hovered in the air. The normal hum of professionalism gave way to a suffocating stillness that no one could explain out loud. Staff members noticed immediately. The florist's face had drained of color, eyes fixed on the name as if it carried weight far heavier than ink on paper. This was not confusion. This was recognition. A slow, dawning realization that the order in front of them was not merely inappropriate, it was dangerous. Not in a physical sense, but emotionally, symbolically. The kind of danger that lingers long after flowers wilt and is remembered by those who understand what certain gestures truly mean within royal circles. Palace credentials were presented, as they always were. The request was politely reiterated. Everything followed protocol, at least on the surface. But the florist didn't move. Instead, the card was placed face down, as if even looking at the name felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Whispers rippled quietly between staff members. Someone asked whether this was a mistake. Someone else suggested calling the palace to confirm. Yet the florist already knew. Confirmation would not change what had been seen, or what it implied. This wasn't just an order for flowers. It was tied to something far more sensitive, an event that had not been announced. A moment not meant to be acknowledged publicly, let alone symbolized through a carefully curated bouquet. The florist understood the unspoken language of these gestures. Flowers could soothe, but they could also provoke. They could heal, but they could also reopen wounds that had never fully closed. And whoever placed this order knew exactly what they were doing. Within minutes, murmurs slipped beyond the shop's walls. Suppliers noticed delays. Assistants sensed tension. A refusal like this was unheard of, and the rarity of it only amplified its significance. Something had gone wrong, and everyone could feel it, even if no one dared say it plainly. The florist, usually invisible, had become the first person to stop a narrative before it could be staged. But the real question wasn't why the florist refused, it was who the flowers were truly meant for. The florist had seen countless royal names over the years, some controversial, some heartbreaking, but never had one caused such an immediate moral standstill. This wasn't a political issue. It wasn't personal resentment. It was recognition. A name connected to grief, betrayal, and a wound the monarchy had never truly healed. And once the florist understood the destination, there was no going back. The delivery card told the story with devastating clarity. Elegant handwriting, carefully chosen words, and beneath them, a name that carried more history than any bouquet ever could. It wasn't just a recipient, it was a reminder. Of moments the palace had tried to move past. Of silences carefully maintained. Of pain that had been managed rather than resolved. The florist didn't need to ask questions. The meaning was immediate and unmistakable, landing with a heaviness that settled in the chest and refused to lift. Memories surfaced uninvited. Quiet warnings given years ago by senior palace aides. Casual remarks framed as advice but understood as rules. Certain names, they had said, were never to be used lightly. Certain gestures, however well-intentioned they appeared, carried consequences that could not be controlled once set in motion. The florist remembered nodding back then, not fully grasping how personal that warning might one day become. Now it echoed loudly. Impossible to ignore. Around the work table, staff sensed the tension tightening. Someone noticed the florist rereading the card, slower this time, as if hoping the name might change. Another whispered that the order carried full palace authorization and refusing it could mean losing everything they had built. Years of trust. A reputation for absolute discretion. Access that few outsiders ever earned. The debate wasn't loud, but it was intense, fueled by the unspoken fear of what saying no might trigger. The conflict deepened with every passing second. Duty pulled in one direction, heavy with obligation and precedent. Conscience pulled in another, sharper and more personal. This wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about whether participation made them complicit in something that felt fundamentally wrong. The florist understood the symbolism better than most. Flowers sent messages when words were too risky to use. They reframed narratives. They softened realities. And this message, if delivered, would speak volumes without ever being questioned publicly. The staff waited. No one moved. It became clear that this decision could not be outsourced or delayed. A call to the palace might smooth logistics, but it wouldn't ease the moral weight pressing down on the room. In the end, the florist straightened, voice steady despite the turmoil underneath, and said what no one expected to hear. The order would not be completed. Not today. Not ever. The choice landed like a dropped glass, silent at first, then shattering in its implications. Consequences were acknowledged without being named. Everyone understood that this refusal would travel fast, slipping through the same discreet channels that usually protected everyone involved. There was no relief, only resolve. The line had been drawn, and stepping back from it was no longer an option. And as word of the refusal reached Camilla's inner circle, the situation escalated from awkward to explosive. At first glance, the order looked generous, elegant blooms, impeccable timing, and a message crafted to appear thoughtful. But insiders quickly realized this was never about flowers. It was about optics. Control. A carefully calculated move meant to rewrite a narrative that had resisted correction for years. And once the florist saw through it, the entire strategy began to collapse. Those close to the process understood how these gestures worked. Nothing within the royal orbit was ever accidental, especially not when emotions ran high and reputations felt fragile. The arrangement itself was designed to signal reconciliation, a public-facing softness meant to suggest maturity, grace, and closure. On paper, it looked harmless, even kind, but kindness was never the goal. The goal was perception, how the act would be interpreted if it quietly surfaced, how it would tilt sympathy, how it would reposition old conflicts under a more flattering light. Timing exposed everything. The order landed at a moment when emotions were already raw, when the palace was navigating a sensitive chapter that required restraint, not performance. Insiders recognized the precision immediately. This wasn't spontaneous generosity. It was deliberate placement, chosen to intersect with a private moment that should never have been reframed for advantage. That intersection was the tell. The florist saw it too, sensing that the gesture was not meant to comfort, but to intervene. Intermediaries had been used, as they often were. No direct fingerprints. No explicit instructions that could later be questioned. Requests passed quietly through trusted hands, each step distancing the originator from responsibility while ensuring the outcome remained exactly as intended. It was elegant. It was careful. And that carefulness was precisely what made it unsettling. The florist understood that when power hides behind politeness, it rarely does so without purpose. What made the order inappropriate wasn't its appearance, but its implication. It assumed emotional access that hadn't been granted. It positioned the sender as central to a story they did not control. And it attempted to soften history without consent from those who had lived it. In the florist's world, symbolism mattered. Flowers could apologize, but they could also intrude. They could honor, but they could also claim space that was never offered. This order did the latter, quietly but unmistakably. As whispers began to spread, early signs of backlash surfaced. Not public outrage yet, but internal discomfort. Advisors exchanged cautious messages. Staff questioned whether this move would be seen as healing or as provocation. The florist's refusal became the first crack in a strategy that depended on seamless execution. Without the flowers, the narrative stalled. Without the narrative, the intent stood exposed. What unsettled many was not just that the plan failed, but why it failed. A neutral party had read between the lines and stepped away. That kind of resistance was rare, and it carried weight. It suggested that the gesture crossed an ethical boundary that couldn't be smoothed over with elegance or authority. The refusal reframed the entire act, turning what was meant to appear gracious into something that felt calculated and invasive. And once that perception took hold, it couldn't be undone. The gesture no longer spoke of reconciliation. It spoke of manipulation, of an attempt to guide emotion rather than respect it. The florist hadn't just declined an order, they had interrupted a story mid-sentence, leaving the palace to confront the meaning behind the silence that followed. Because this wasn't just a personal gesture, it was a message aimed straight at the heart of the royal family. There are unspoken rules within the monarchy lines, never written down but understood by everyone who survives inside its walls. The florist had learned them early. Some names are never invoked lightly, some gestures are never staged, and some wounds are never to be reopened. This order violated all three, placing the florist in an impossible position. These rules existed because history had taught the palace hard lessons. Every carefully maintained silence had been earned through previous mistakes, moments when symbolism ran ahead of sensitivity and left lasting scars behind. The florist understood that flowers, while delicate, carried enormous weight in royal life. They were never neutral. They could signal forgiveness, claim proximity, or quietly rewrite the emotional balance of a moment. That power was why boundaries existed in the first place, and why crossing them was never accidental. Certain gestures were forbidden precisely because they invited interpretation. A bouquet could suggest closure where none had been granted, or authority where none was owed. Past missteps had proven how quickly such symbols could ignite resentment instead of peace. The palace still remembered moments when well-meaning acts had reopened national debates, fractured private relationships, and left senior figures scrambling to explain intentions that should never have been tested. Those memories lingered, unspoken but alive, shaping every cautious decision that followed. The emotional consequences of breaking protocol were never theoretical. They were personal, deeply felt, and often irreversible. For those on the receiving end, a misplaced gesture could feel like erasure, as if their pain had been repackaged into something palatable for public consumption. The florist felt that truth sharply now. Sending those flowers would not soothe grief, it would reshape it without permission. It would turn a private boundary into a public statement, whether anyone intended it or not. Fear crept in as the implications settled. Refusing a royal order was not just professionally risky, it was existential. Years of loyalty could evaporate in a single moment. Access could be revoked. Trust could be withdrawn without explanation or appeal. The florist knew this, felt it pressed down with every passing second. Yet that fear was matched by something stronger, the understanding that compliance would leave a permanent mark, one that could not be justified away later. Refusal then became less a choice and more a necessity. It was the only way to honor the rules that had protected so many from deeper harm. The only way to avoid becoming part of a story that would inevitably twist intention into controversy. In that quiet moment, the florist accepted the fallout before it arrived, choosing conscience over convenience, restraint over obedience. The line had been crossed already. The only remaining decision was whether to step back or be dragged further in. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with the knowledge that this act of resistance would not stay contained. Within royal circles, refusals spoke louder than explanations. They hinted at deeper tensions, unacknowledged truths, and boundaries still fiercely defended. The florist knew the message would travel quickly, stripped of nuance, interpreted through layers of power and expectation. But Camilla was not prepared to accept a refusal, especially not one rooted in conscience. When the refusal reached Camilla, the response was immediate and icy. This wasn't embarrassment. It was fury. A plan she believed was flawless had been dismantled by someone she never expected to defy her. And as calls were made and explanations demanded, it became clear that the damage extended far beyond a single florist. Disbelief came first, the kind that tightens the jaw before the anger fully arrives. In Camilla's mind, refusals belonged to negotiations, not to instructions delivered through long-established channels. She had calculated every step, trusted the system to move as it always had, and suddenly found herself confronting a word she rarely heard directed at her. No. It landed not as defiance, but as rejection, and that distinction mattered more than anyone realized in that moment. Attempts to override the decision followed quickly. Polite at first, then firmer. Messages were relayed through intermediaries who spoke carefully, framing the refusal as a misunderstanding that could still be corrected. Credentials were re-emphasized. Expectations were subtly restated. The assumption was simple. Pressure would restore order. It always had. Yet with each unanswered call and each reaffirmed refusal, something shifted. Control, once assumed, began to feel less certain. The emotional undertones changed fast. What started as confidence hardened into agitation. Camilla understood perception better than most, and what unsettled her wasn't the lost bouquet, it was the signal the refusal sent. If a trusted supplier felt empowered to say no, others might quietly reconsider their own boundaries. Authority depended on compliance that never had to be enforced. The moment enforcement became necessary, the illusion weakened. Behind the scenes, concern crept in. Advisors weighed in cautiously, choosing words that didn't inflame but also didn't reassure. Questions surfaced about how the situation might be interpreted if it traveled beyond private channels. A refusal rooted in conscience was far harder to neutralize than one based on logistics. It carried moral weight, and moral weight attracted attention. The realization stung. This wasn't just a setback, it was a vulnerability. Internal panic took shape in fragments. Who knew already? How many people had witnessed the refusal? How quickly could whispers turn into assumptions, and assumptions into narratives? Camilla understood how quickly stories formed in royal circles, how they grew legs without ever being spoken aloud. The fear wasn't scandal yet, but it hovered close enough to demand action. As pressure continued through intermediaries, another truth became impossible to ignore. The florist hadn't refused out of confusion or fear. They had refused deliberately, calmly, and with resolve. That made reversal unlikely, and exposure more dangerous. Each attempt to assert control only sharpened the contrast between authority and resistance, drawing a line that hadn't existed before. The room for maneuver narrowed. What had been designed as a quiet gesture now threatened to become a lesson in limits. The more Camilla pushed, the more the refusal seemed justified to those watching from a distance. And somewhere in that realization, a deeper frustration took hold, the understanding that this story, if it escaped containment, would not be told on her terms. And leak it did straight into the most sensitive corners of the royal household. This wasn't about flowers being denied. It was about authority being questioned. When a longtime palace supplier says no, it sends a message louder than any press release. The refusal exposed fault lines between image and reality, power and morality, and forced the royal family to confront truths they had long tried to soften. In royal life, symbolism is currency. A refusal, especially one delivered quietly and without theatrics, carries an almost seismic meaning. It suggests that the invisible machinery of compliance has faltered. That someone, somewhere inside the orbit of privilege and protocol, has decided that obedience has limits. The palace understands this instinctively. It's why such moments are feared, not because they are loud, but because they are honest. And honesty, when it emerges unexpectedly, destabilizes carefully maintained narratives. The message sent by this refusal traveled faster than anyone anticipated. It signaled internal dissent without naming names, hinting that not everyone within the extended royal ecosystem was comfortable with the direction being taken. That discomfort mattered. It suggested that moral lines still existed even when power assumed they had faded. For advisors, this was deeply unsettling. Authority depends not just on rank, but on shared belief in the system itself. When belief weakens, control becomes fragile. Fear of precedent followed close behind. If one supplier could refuse on ethical grounds, what stopped others from quietly doing the same? What prevented aides, partners, or long-serving insiders from reevaluating their own roles in moments that felt misaligned with conscience? The palace had seen this before in different forms. One crack invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites questions. And questions, once asked, rarely stay contained. Behind closed doors, advisors moved quickly, not to punish but to contain. Language was softened. The refusal was reframed as an anomaly, a misunderstanding, something technical rather than principled. But beneath the surface, urgency pulsed. They knew the truth couldn't be rewritten entirely. Too many people had already felt the shift. Too many had registered the discomfort and quietly stored it away. Staff morale absorbed the shock in subtle ways. For some, the refusal felt like validation, a rare acknowledgement that boundaries still mattered. For others, it triggered anxiety about instability, about what happens when the rules everyone relies on begin to bend. The palace thrives on predictability. This moment introduced doubt, and doubt has a way of spreading even when no one speaks it aloud. Then there was the embarrassment, unspoken, but sharp. Rejection, especially from someone expected to comply, carries a particular sting. It inverts the hierarchy, if only briefly. The palace does not respond well to inversion, even temporary. The knowledge that this refusal existed, that it could not be erased, weighed heavily. It sat between conversations, colored decisions, and sharpened every subsequent interaction. What made the situation more precarious was the absence of spectacle. No confrontation. No public declaration. Just a simple refusal rooted in principle. That restraint gave it credibility. It made it harder to dismiss, harder to undermine. The palace could manage scandals, it could spin misunderstandings. But managing conscience was far more complicated. And as advisors debated strategy and language, one reality loomed larger than all the rest. The story was no longer contained within institutional walls. It had emotional gravity now, pulling toward someone who had yet to hear it. Someone for whom the implications would land far more personally than politically. But the most devastating impact was still to come because the intended recipient was about to find out. The flowers never arrived, but the message did. When the intended recipient learned about the order, the refusal, and the reason behind it, the emotional reaction was raw. This wasn't seen as kindness, it wasn't seen as peace. It was interpreted as intrusion, an attempt to rewrite a story that didn't belong to Camilla to tell. The news landed quietly, without ceremony, yet it struck with a force that words could not soften. What hurt most wasn't the gesture itself, but the assumption behind it. The belief that a carefully timed symbol could step into a space carved by grief and claim relevance there. For the recipient, the revelation felt less like outreach and more like appropriation, an effort to frame pain in a way that served someone else's narrative. That realization lingered, heavy and unresolved. There was a sharp sense of being used symbolically, of becoming a backdrop to an image crafted elsewhere. The idea that such a personal chapter could be touched, even indirectly, without consent, reopened wounds that had been guarded for years. Old memories surfaced uninvited. Moments of loss that had been managed privately, away from the gaze of strategy and optics. The refusal suddenly made sense not as an inconvenience, but as an act of restraint that respected boundaries others had ignored. Pain threaded through the response, not loud or dramatic, but deep and consuming. This wasn't anger meant for public display. It was the quiet ache of realizing that even now, the past could still be reshaped without permission. The recipient understood the language of symbolism as well as anyone, and that understanding made the gesture sting more, not less. Flowers could speak, yes, but here they would have spoken over someone else's truth. Outwardly, there was silence. No statements. No reaction offered for interpretation. That restraint was deliberate, born from years of learning that public responses often invite further intrusion. Privately, however, the weight of it all settled in. The florist's refusal was viewed not as defiance, but as protection, an unexpected ally who chose not to let a line be crossed. That choice carried quiet gratitude, even as the situation itself remained painful. The ripple effect was subtle but powerful. Conversations shifted. Assumptions were reconsidered. Those close to the recipient felt the impact immediately, sensing that something delicate had been disturbed. It wasn't just about what almost happened, but about what it revealed, that certain wounds were still vulnerable, still capable of being reopened by gestures framed as generosity. The refusal became a kind of shield, imperfect but meaningful. In that space between private hurt and public composure, The story took on new gravity. What began as a controlled move elsewhere had now touched the very person it was never meant to confront directly. The emotional cost was real, even if it remained unseen. And once emotion enters a story like this, it rarely stays contained for long. And as the palace assessed the emotional damage, another fear emerged: what happens if this story goes public? Within hours, advisors moved fast. Calls were placed. Narratives were drafted. The goal wasn't correction, it was containment. Because if the public learned that even trusted palace figures were pushing back, it would expose cracks no amount of ceremony could hide. Emergency meetings unfolded behind closed doors, urgent but controlled. Voices lowered not out of calm but caution. This was the kind of situation no protocol manual ever truly covered. Not a scandal, not yet. Not a leak, but dangerously close. Advisors understood the stakes immediately. This wasn't about an external threat. It was about an internal one, dissent expressed quietly, but unmistakably. The kind that undermines authority without ever raising its voice. Efforts to suppress the story began subtly. Phone calls framed as check-ins. Gentle reminders about discretion. A shared understanding that silence served everyone best. The refusal was discussed not as an act of conscience, but as a procedural hiccup, a misunderstanding, a logistical snag. Language mattered now more than ever, because language would decide whether this moment hardened into truth or dissolved into rumor. Reframing became the primary strategy. Advisors tested phrases carefully, gauging which explanations felt plausible without drawing attention. The florist, they suggested, had misinterpreted the request. Or perhaps there had been confusion around timing. Nothing malicious, nothing ideological, just a minor disruption exaggerated by proximity to power. Yet even as these explanations circulated internally, few fully believed them. The tension between transparency and control sharpened with every exchange. The palace thrived on narrative discipline, but discipline only worked when the story aligned with reality. Here, it didn't. Quietly, blame began to shift. Not openly, never directly, but in the careful way institutions protect themselves. Who authorized the approach? Who approved the intermediaries? Who failed to anticipate resistance? Names were never spoken aloud, but accountability hovered uncomfortably in the room. The goal was not justice, it was insulation. Someone would eventually absorb responsibility, if only to stabilize the structure. Underlying everything was a deeper fear, the loss of narrative dominance. The monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to shape meaning without appearing to try. Ritual over explanation. Symbol over statement. This refusal disrupted that balance. It introduced a counter-narrative rooted not in rebellion but in restraint. And restraint, when it comes from within, is far harder to discredit. Advisors knew that if this story escaped containment, it wouldn't erupt as scandal. It would spread as doubt. The most dangerous kind. Questions whispered instead of shouted. Why was the order refused? What did the florist see that others ignored? If boundaries were crossed here, where else had they been tested? Each unanswered question threatened to widen the cracks everyone was working so desperately to seal. The palace had weathered storms before, but this felt different. There was no external villain to rally against. No hostile press to condemn. Only a simple refusal and the silence that followed it. Silence that invited interpretation. Silence that lingered. No statement could erase it entirely. No amount of coordination could fully neutralize its meaning. And as containment strategies layered over one another, a quiet realization settled in. This moment could be managed, delayed, even obscured, but it could not be undone. The refusal existed now, anchored in memory, shaping perceptions in ways no briefing note could reverse. But one final truth lingered: this refusal had already said more than any statement ever could. In a monarchy built on tradition and obedience, a single refusal can become an act of rebellion. The florist didn't make a speech. They didn't leak documents. They simply said no, and in doing so, exposed the emotional boundaries that power cannot force its way through. That quiet resistance carried a symbolism far larger than the act itself. In a world where gestures are choreographed and silence is often strategic, the absence of flowers spoke with startling clarity. It reminded everyone watching closely or from a distance that morality does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in restraint. Sometimes it takes shape in the courage to stop rather than proceed. And in a system built on momentum, stopping can feel revolutionary. Small acts carry massive weight precisely because they are unexpected. The florist was not a royal, not a politician, not a public figure with an agenda to promote. That neutrality gave the refusal its force. It wasn't rebellion for attention. It wasn't defiance for leverage. It was a boundary drawn by someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and that made it impossible to dismiss as noise or nuisance. Public perception, as always, threatened to flatten the truth. From the outside, this might one day be framed as a minor disruption, a footnote in a larger narrative carefully curated for consumption. But privately, the truth landed harder. Those inside the palace understood what had happened. They felt the shift. They recognized that something intangible but vital had asserted itself: emotional legitimacy over image management. For once, optics had been denied the final word. This moment also revealed something uncomfortable about Camilla's standing. Not in titles or protocol, but in emotional authority. Power can request compliance, even expect it, but it cannot demand acceptance in spaces governed by grief, memory, and personal truth. The refusal underscored that distinction. It showed that while influence can be wide-reaching, it is not absolute. There are still rooms it cannot enter uninvited. A quiet line had been drawn, and it could not be erased. Not by explanations, not by statements, not by time. The florist's decision had already settled into the collective consciousness of the institution, reshaping how future gestures would be considered, how boundaries would be sensed rather than tested. It left behind a lesson no memo could teach: that respect is not proven by action alone, but by restraint. As the palace moved forward, ceremonies would continue, messages would be refined, and appearances would remain polished. But beneath it all, the echo of that refusal would persist. A reminder that even within the most controlled environments, there are limits that cannot be negotiated. Limits rooted not in rank, but in humanity. Because long after the flowers wilt, the message of that refusal will still be echoing through the palace halls. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.